What's up guys, Lvladen here, and today I'm coming at you with our tier list maker video for the War Within expansion. We have just a couple days before the release of the next X-Pack, so let's take a look and see how the classes are doing on the beta in PvP right now. So one of the reasons that I'm waiting until almost the last day to make this before the expansion launches is because Blizzard has been frequently tuning the classes in the last week or so, and they're bug fixing, so this might not be accurate in a couple weeks, and if that's the case, I'll make another. But as of August 20th, this is how I feel about the classes in PvP. All right, so let's start off with Arms Warrior. So if you're a Warrior main, it's a good time. It's a great time to be a Warrior main. Both specs, Arms and Fury, have been probably overperforming in the beta. One is a little bit better than the other. At the moment, I'd say Arms Warrior, and by the way, I'm making this tier list for mostly arenas. It's arena based. I'll make a rated Battleground Blitz tier list in the next expansion. I'm sorry, in the next like week or two. But I would drop Arms somewhere in the A tier. It's going to have multiple viable comps. It does a little bit better solo in PvP than it did before. It's less healer reliant, as Second Wind made a return, as Colossus healing. So overall, Arms Warrior damage is pretty high in the beta, but it definitely gets outshone by Fury right now. Fury Warrior is probably the best, if not the second best melee in the game right now. Fury Warrior has some of the highest single target bursts, some of the highest single target sustain. It has a gigantic Mortal Strike effect, and it has pretty decent self-healing and mobility. I'd say the only thing that is checking Fury Warrior right now is Frost Mage, in which case Frost Mage is also one of the best classes in the game. But right now, if you are a melee player looking for a simple melee class, an effective melee class, the Warrior is probably for you, more specifically Fury. But I'm going to put it in the probably going to get nerfed category because it is just kind of bonkers right now. We're going to evaluate tanks at the end, and I'll line up all the tanks in the order that I think is best. Next up, we have Assassination Rogue, one of my favorites, and my main rogue spec that I play is Assassination. Assassination's actually doing really well. It's been buffed several builds in a row. Doesn't have as high of survivability as it had in Dragonflight, but its damage and CC still kind of makes up for that. I'm going to go ahead and toss Assassination in the A tier. I do believe we are going to see a good amount of Assassination when paired with some of the other more powerful casters in Arena. And it's also pretty good in Battleground Blitz. It has insane cleave damage, absolutely insane cleave damage. The next class right here, Sub Rogue. I'm going to drop Sub Rogue in the S tier. Sub Rogue is absolutely pumping right now, has some of the strongest single target bursts in the game, and it still holds on to its Shadow Dance versus the other Rogue specs, which actually lost Shadow Dance. Sub Rogue did receive some nerfs in the survivability department, a little bit less self-healing than it has had in the past, but overall it should be one of those melee specs that are actually defining comps, rather than attaching itself to like what is the most OP caster at the moment. Even though it still can do that, by the way, like it's still a very powerful class in itself. All right, so then lastly we have Outlaw, and if you guys have been playing the beta, you probably have not seen too much Outlaw. Outlaw rogues are really uncommon right now, but that's not because Outlaw is actually bad. Outlaw, for the few Outlaw rogues I've seen, it has very strong, consistent cleave damage, and it has high CC potential, similar to how it was in Dragonflight. So whenever you see Sub Rogues take a nerf or Astro Rogues take a nerf, expect the Outlaw tier to potentially rise. I swear it's actually not that bad. Next up, we have Hunters. So Marksman Hunter right now is something that I played a decent chunk on the beta. It's definitely one of my favorite range specs at the moment, and it's going to be strong in Arena and in Rated Battleground Blitz. One of the reasons that Hunters are doing fairly well right now are the fact that they are one of the small checks to how strong casters are right now. So, you're going to see a lot of mages in Arena. Marksman might do decent into that. I'm going to toss Marksman in the A tier. I do think Marksman is probably the strongest of the three Hunter specs right now. It's easy to play. It has very strong burst. And overall, it's doing pretty well in beta PvP. Next up, we have my historically favorite Hunter spec, Survival, the only spec that I've ever left my ret main for any period of time. And I'm going to toss Survival on the B tier. I don't think it's quite as strong as Marksman. It has very strong damage, very strong cleave damage. But one of the gripes with Survival right now is you don't have a controlled way to stop your burst from being AoE. So Survival Hunter is kind of suffering in that aspect where you really want to play these setup CC comps, but you can't really do that because of Explosive Shot and Wildfire Bomb being your primary damage sources. But it does, you know, you can always play Diamond Ice and you can get away with some forms of cleaves. I guess maybe something like a Survival Hunter DK comp could be interesting, a Survival Hunter Feral Druid. But overall, it's not the best melee right now, but it's also not doing terrible. Next up, we have BM Hunter. Excuse me. BM Hunter is probably one of the weakest specs overall in the game right now. I would probably put BM somewhere on the C or D tier list. It's just undertuned at the moment, and it doesn't offer anything that the other two Hunter specs already, don't do. So we're going to throw BM Hunter on the D tier, and we'll see what happens to tuning. Personally, I'm not terribly upset by this. I'm not a huge fan of fighting pet classes over and over. Next up, we have a tank class, Vengeance. I'll talk about that later. Havoc Demon Hunter has received a number of buffs in the past couple beta builds. If you asked me like 2-3 weeks ago how this was, I would have said it was like C tier. But recently, Havoc has kind of made a comeback, and I'm going to toss Havoc on the A tier right here. It has strong sustain. It's not the best dueling class, but it's going to have a number of viable arena comps. If you ask me, probably Fury, DH, DK, maybe even DH Ret Paladin. Not entirely sure about that one. DH Acid Rogue, DH Feral. It could fit in a number of comps here. And even DH Caster. It has pretty decent damage, pretty decent survivability. The only thing that I think people are a little upset over the Havoc are the hero talent trees. I have heard that it's not super exciting, but it is still an effective class, and I'm going to drop it on the A tier, and I'll order these at the end here. Another tank class, we have Guardian. Guardian's pretty good. And then Feral. So, welcome back, Feral Druids. Feral Druid, in my opinion, when piloted by a good player, is the best melee in the game right now. Whereas, if you're an average player, Fury Warrior is probably the best. But if you are a really good Feral Druid, or even if you're not so great Feral Druid, Feral has some of the strongest single target burst and still has very high bleed potential. And its self-healing is good, and its off-healing is not terrible now. So Feral Druid is coming up in this tier right here, and it's probably going to get nerfed in PvP if I had to take a guess. But it's very fun, and even if it gets nerfed, I don't think it's going to be bad. It could still float around somewhere in the SA range because of the way that its hero talents are set up. Feral Druid is very, very strong right now. Next up, we have our first healer. Resto Druid. So Resto Druid, I'm going to toss it in the S tier for now. I think it's one of the better healers. Maybe not the best healer, but it's definitely up there in the top 3 at the moment. Resto Druid has high wrath damage, so they kind of brought back, or they kind of brought Resto Druid damage up overall and made it so you can kind of heal through throwing out your wraths. It's an interesting spec. It is killable, that's the thing. So like Resto Druid can die into certain comps, like Fury Warrior and Feral Druid are both really good at killing Resto Druid. But it probably has some of the highest both sustain and burst healing in the game right now. Next up, we have Boomy. A lot of people have mentioned that they don't think Boomy is that good. I actually think Boomy is pretty good. I think it's just overshadowed by the fact that there are some other casters that are like super S tier gonna get nerfed. But Boomy is probably, I want to toss Boomy in S tier. I think Boomy is one of those specs that's kind of going under the radar right now. You still have access to Cyclone, you still have very strong burst, you have strong sustain. The only thing is you're not an Affliction Lock, you're not a Frost Mage. But I do think when some of these other more powerful casters are going to get tuned, the Boomy tier is going to rise on most people's radars from like 8S. So I'm going to go ahead and drop it in S tier. And by the way, you're in an insane class for Battleground Blitz. You have knockoffs, you have AoE dot damage, you have stealth. So overall, Boomy is doing really well right now. Next up, we have Frost DK. Frost DK took some nerfs in the past couple weeks. If you guys have been paying attention to my YouTube, I have been playing a good amount of Frost DK. Frost DK, I'm going to go ahead and toss it in the... I want to put it in S tier, but because Fury and Feral are so high up there, they kind of counter DKs historically. I'm going to go ahead and throw Frost... You know, we're going to keep Frost DK in the S tier right here. I do think there's going to be a number of comps where Frost DK is good. Rider of the Apocalypse, it has received some nerfs, and so has Deathbringer. But I think Frost has 2 hero talent trees that are pretty good still. So I'm going to keep Frost in the S tier until proven otherwise in the beginning of the expansion. Blizzard has been known for nerfing DKs in the beginning of expansions when they're pretty good. I don't think Frost is like the most OP of the S tier classes right now. I just think it's pretty overall good. And then we have Unholy DK. I'm going to throw Unholy DK on the S tier and put it a little bit closer in than Frost. It's a little bit better than Frost right now. It has insane sustain, insane cleave. And the only thing that it kind of lacks right now is that, you know, its PvP talents are kind of locked in. It's not very flexible there. But overall, if you are a player returning, or you're a player interested in checking out Death Knight, both specializations are very strong in the War Within, and definitely worth playing. We have another Blood spec. That's tank. All right, so we have Devastation right here. Devastation is S tier for sure. It has one of the easiest rotations in the game, so getting out its damage is very simple. Its survivability is pretty decent, and now your Disintegrates cleave, which is nuts. So, like, if you guys have been following my channel, I'm a Ret main. Individual ticks of Disintegrate hit harder than Final Verdict. So think about that. Individual ticks of Disintegrate hit harder than Final Verdict. Devastation is pretty nuts right now. If you're enjoying it in Dragonflight, you definitely are going to enjoy it in the War Within. It's like an upgraded version. You can move around with your breath. Oh man, the name of the spell is it's eluding me right now. But Devastation is very good, S tier spec, and it's generally pretty good in solo shuffle as well. Augmentation. Interestingly enough, Augmentation has been doing better right now than it has been in the majority of Dragonflight after the nerfs. Augmentation, I would put it in like an A or B tier right now. It has pretty strong single target burst and sustain. The only thing is it's really outshone by Devastation at the moment. So I'm going to go ahead and throw it in the B tier, where it's not terrible. Like, it's not the worst of the worst, but it's also not meta defining. And here we have it. The best healer in the game. If you guys are interested in playing the best healer, the most OP healer in the game, it is this one right here. Preservation. Probably deserving, probably warranting nerfs. You have easily the strongest sustain, the strongest burst healing, and the most damage of any healer. Which, by the way, it is close between Preservation, Discipline Priest, and Resto Druid for the most damage, but I do think Preservation probably edges it out a little bit. Don't expect this to last forever like this. I think they're probably going to continue balancing the healers, but Preservation is the healer to be right now for Arena. It could get shown up a little bit in Battleground Blitz, and the reasoning is your heals aren't, you know, the same range as all the other healers out there. But if you're talking about just being overall the best right now, it's probably Preservation. Next up, we have Paladins, man. Paladins, what are we going to do? Catching nerfs left and right week after week. Holy Paladin, for most of beta, was actually fairly strong. I'm going to go ahead and drop Holy Paladin in the B tier right now. I don't think Holy Paladin is as good as some of the other healing specs. It took some pretty chunky nerfs almost everywhere, damage-wise, healing-wise. It's not the best, but it's definitely going to be overall better than it was in Dragonflight. Holy Paladin was pretty weak for the latter half of Dragonflight, so I am expecting it to maybe get some PvP buffs before the start of the season, if not shortly after. I do miss playing HPAL, and I miss HPAL being good. Typically, when HPAL is good, Red Paladin does well into HPAL. So it's nice healer meta versus, you know, when I'm a Ret main and I have to fight a Resto Druid meta, I really hate it. But HPAL, better than it was in Dragonflight. Not as good as it was a couple of weeks ago. I think it could see some play in rated Battleground Blitz, especially with having access to Blessing of Protection and Blessing of Sacrifice. Very good for flag carriers, but overall not the best potency healer. All right, now you have me. I'm up. All right, Ret Paladin right here. Ret Paladin has been plagued with a couple of issues throughout beta, most of which are bug related and some of which are tuning related. I'm gonna go ahead and throw Ret in the... It's tough. It's either B or C tier right now. I don't want to say... It's not as good as Survival Hunter, but it's not as bad as BM Hunter or an Enhancement Shaman, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But I want to go ahead and throw Ret Paladin on B tier, pending the bug fixes. No, I'm sorry. I'm going to throw Ret Paladin on C tier, pending bug fixes. If the bugs get fixed with Ret Paladin and no other tuning happens, Ret can go up to B tier in my opinion. But until the bugs are fixed or a little bit of tuning happens, I don't think Ret is deserving of the B tier spot. The reasoning is you aren't one of the meta-defining classes. You don't have a large number of comps anymore. Your single target burst is pretty weak compared to what it used to be. Ret does do a little bit more healing in the War Within than it did in previous expansions. And you do have high cleave sustained damage now, but really your damage is just overshadowed by a lot of other specializations, whatever you want to say. Casters, other melee tiers, it's pretty weak right now. But it's playable. I'm going to play it. I'm going to main it. It's still fun. I do think once the bugs are fixed, which I'll leave a link in the description to my video that I did on the bugs, it should be a little bit better. But until then, C tier, unfortunately, guys. Sorry about that. Prop Paladin, thanks, Beck. Talk about it later. Discipline Priest. In my opinion, it's one of the top 3 healers right now. It's somewhere between Resto Druid and Resto Shaman. This Priest is up here in the S tier. Gonna have plenty of comps. Has pretty strong AoE healing with its absorbs. It has strong single target and it has great damage and atonement healing right now. And its mana isn't as bad as it has been in the past. So Discipline Priest, S tier. I think it's going to be great in Battleground Blitz. It's going to be great in a number of arena comps. And I highly recommend it to anyone that enjoys a more offensive healer playstyle, which a lot of the healers, by the way, have been scaling into the offensive healer playstyle. And now we have Holy Priest, probably tied for one of the worst healers in the game right now. I don't want to put it on D tier because Holy might have some aspects that are positive to it, but overall it's just outshone by all the other healers, including Discipline Priest. Mainly why I'm going to drop Holy Priest into the C tier right here. Now we have Shadow Priest. Interestingly enough, I think Shadow is again one of those boomy style caster DPS where it's being outshone by some of the other super S plus tier casters. I think Shadow probably has a number of comps that are good for it, and I don't think it's as strong as Boomy because it is lacking Cyclone, but its damage and sustain overall are fairly strong. I'm going to drop it on the A tier, and the reason I'm not putting it on the S tier with Boomy is because of these 2 specs right here, specifically Fury Warrior. Fury Warrior tears into Shadow Priest like no other. So even though Shadow Priest has a high amount of self-sustain from your healing and your damage, you're just going to get ripped apart by Fury Warriors, the God tier Fury Warrior right now. So I'm going to throw you on the A tier, but Shadow Priest should have a number of good comps, including Shadow Frost Mage, Shadow Boomy, and maybe even like Shadow Fury Warrior could be pretty good. But I'm going to throw it on the A tier. Not quite as good as Boomy, and definitely not as good as some of the other casters right now. Next up, we have Windwalker Monk. Windwalker Monk has taken a couple... So Windwalker Monk for the majority of beta has been... It's been up and down, up and down. Windwalker Monk I'm going to place on A tier because of the recent fixes to its primary burst cooldown. What's it? Storm, Earth, Fire, something like that. Your Shadow Clone Jutsu, whatever you want to call it. Those clones can no longer be crowd controlled and they move 20% faster. So Windwalker went from being really bad to actually pretty good. You have strong burst, you have pretty decent sustain, and your defensives, although they took a couple nerfs, you're still up there. You're not one of the meta-defining melee DPS, but you're also no longer gimped by some of the design changes in the hero trees. The removal of Serenity is not as impactful. You also have, you're one of the few classes that has 2 viable hero talent trees in PvP, which is always a plus. So overall, Windwalker Monk, I'm going to toss it in the A tier. A little bit better than Survival. Definitely not as good as, maybe a Sub-Rogue. Brewmaster, tank spec, we'll talk about in a little bit. Mistweaver Monk, unfortunately, I don't know if I want to put it as low as Holy, because Fistweavers are actually not that bad. They could see some play, but Casted Mistweaver is really bad. I'd say like Fistweaver is B tier, Casted Mistweaver is C tier. I don't know how to fix Mistweaver. Like, I would refer anyone that plays Mistweaver and you really want to check this spec out to go check out Mystical. He'll have a lot more insight than I do. I do think Mistweaver, though, is overall struggling in the mana department. Its potency for its heals are pretty decent, but it offers, if you play Casted Mistweaver, it offers no clear advantage over some of the other healers. In Battleground Blitz, it actually might be pretty good. You know, you have Peaceweaver, the AoE Magic Dispel or Protection. It's great. But Mistweaver overall, I'm going to drop it in the C tier. I think it's a little bit better than Holy, but not by that much. All right, Destro Warlock. Destro Warlock is one of the specs that have seen some up and down changes. A couple weeks ago, it was doing 8 million Chaos Bolts, like literally 8 million Chaos Bolts. But now it costs some nerfs. You don't have to cast much on Destro anymore. Most of your damage is instant. I'm going to go ahead and throw Destro on the low A tier. You're going to be able to play with some of the better caster specs and probably find some success, even maybe like playing caster warrior or something like that. Destro warrior could be okay. It's definitely not the best caster spec at the moment, but it's also not the worst. Now we have Affliction, probably tied for the best caster right now. Affliction is probably going to get nerfed, in my opinion. You now have insane single target burst on Affliction and insane cleave damage. Affliction, compared to previous expansions, it heals for a little bit less than it did in Dragonflight, but what it heals less for and its lower defensive capabilities are definitely made up for its bonkers damage. If you don't mind casting Shadow Bolt now, if that doesn't throw you off on an Affliction Warlock, I definitely recommend picking it up. It's going to be one of the meta-defining caster DPS classes in the game. And overall, I had a little bit of fun blasting people on my Affliction lock on beta. All right. Now we have my historical favorite lock spec, which has just been suffering the past couple of seasons, and the suffering continues. Destro Warlock. Probably the... not Destro. Demo Warlock. Probably the worst caster spec in the game. Overall, you have low sustained damage. You have a little bit better burst than Dragonflight. But it's still, you can still just walk away from it. I don't think Demo is that great right now. And it's going to suffer in Battleground Blitz as well. I'm not sure what to do about Demo. I feel like it probably is in need of a rework, but it gets so many reworks and so many changes that I feel like they don't hit the mark. If I had to recommend anything for Demo Warlock, I would say bring it back to Warlords of Draenor and before. I think Metamorphosis needs to come back for Demo Lock. They just need something else. I don't think it's very enjoyable in PvP relying solely on all your AI pets, your wild imps to do your damage, your billion pets. I also really hate fighting Demo Warlocks because it's a bunch of screen clutter. So I'm kind of glad that it's down here, but for any Demo Lock main, I feel for you. Sucks. Frost Mage. Here we go. The best, in my opinion, caster in the game right now, tied with Affliction Lock. I do think... So one of the reasons that Frost is so good right now is you hardly have to cast your damage. Almost everything comes from instant casts, primarily your Ice Lance, and your few casted abilities, they are on typically split spell schools. So if you're playing PvP, you might take Ring of Fire, which is a fire school. It's not going to lock you out of your Frost abilities. If you do have a channeled spell, Ray of Frost, it's one of your few casted or channeled abilities that you can get kicked on. Deals absolutely nutty single target damage. And your healing and survivability is pretty strong. Excuse me. Overall, Frost is probably one of the easier specs to play. Mage-wise, it's not suffering from some of the similar problems that some of the same problems that Arcane has, which are getting locked on one school. You have multiple schools. You have the Frostfire school now in the War Within. Overall, I think Frostmage is deserving of a little bit of time in the spotlight. I think it's been kind of boring to play, in my opinion, since the removal of Deep Freeze. So I'm kind of glad that, you know, it's back in a way. It's just kind of obnoxious when you're proccing these Ice Nova roots over and over and over on people. And even though the Ice Nova damage has been nerfed, it's still running into that problem where, like, it's very, very, very difficult to hit a Frost Mage as a melee player without a freedom. Even Fury Warriors, who are probably the best melee spec right now, are suffering into the wrath of Frost Mages. So I'll expect to see some nerfs on Frost Mage, but I hope they don't destroy it, because it is probably one of my favorite caster specs to play. All right, next up we have Arcane Mage. Arcane throughout beta has been fairly strong. It's taken some nerfs lately, and it plays slightly different than it did in Dragonflight. I very much enjoy Arcane. I'm going to throw Arcane on probably the high B tier or low A tier. I don't think it's as good as Boomy, but I don't think it's as bad as some of the other caster specs in the game here. It's definitely not as bad as Demo Lock. I'm going to throw it on the low A tier. I don't think it's deserving of S tier like Frost Mage here, but it has fairly strong single target damage. It has very high kiting capabilities. It has pretty, what was I even going to say? It has pretty decent self-sustain. And overall, I think it could see some play in Battleground Blitz with its Nox and its CC. So, A tier. Fire Mage, D tier. Fire is just lacking in tuning right now. I don't think it's that great. I did play a good amount of Fire in Dragonflight. And when your Ignites and your Pyros and your Fireballs and your Fire Blasts were just blasting, melting people, it was very fun. But right now, I think Fire is just in need of some tuning. I don't think Fire's bad as Demo. So I'm going to place it on the higher side of the D tier. But overall, Fire is probably suffering, especially when you compare it to how good Frost Mage is and how good Arcane Mage is. Fire, D tier. Next up, we have Resto Shaman, one of my favorite healer specs to play, and the only healer that I actually kind of push rating on once upon a time is Resto Shaman. I think Resto Shaman is deserving of a high tier on this list. I don't think it's as good as Discipline Priest, but it's honestly up there in the S tier. And maybe some people will disagree with me, maybe some won't, but I think Resto Shaman right near is S tier. It's pretty close to how well Resto Druid and Discipline Priest are doing. It has great sustain, it has great burst, it has some forms of damage now, and overall I think it will be a very satisfying healer to play. In the War Within, Stone Bulwark Totem, another instance of increased survivability for Resto Shaman. It's a great time, and highly recommend it to new players. It's not a super difficult healer spec to get into. Also, obviously, you have a high amount of totems to manage, but if you just want to heal Battlegrounds, I think Resto Shaman could be great. All right, next up, we have the worst melee in the game right now, Enhanced Shaman. Not as bad as not as bad as these tank specs down here in terms of damage, but honestly, like, I tried to make Enhanced work during the beta. I recorded a lot of videos. I never released them. It just, like, it's suffering right now. If you can get on a target, Enhanced has okay damage. Tempest, it hits really hard. It's just all your other abilities don't really hit that hard. You're kind of stuck in if you play the melee build, your hardest hitting abilities are still Lightning Bolt and Tempest. And if you play the Elementalist build, you're kind of relying on your uptime and your LE blasts. And Enhanced really does not have that great of uptime. I don't really know how to fix this outside of straight buffing the damage. And also the mobility. Enhanced kind of feels like it is lacking compared to some of the other specs, the melee specs in the game. Again, Ret is not as bad as Enhanced. It's a little bit better, but not by much. It's suffering in terms of damage. Actually, Enhanced's survivability, I'd say, is overall better than Dragonflight. You gained access to Stone Bulwark Totem while still having access to Ancestral Guidance and your wall, and now your self-healing is pretty decent. It's just like, in order to get that self-healing off, you need to generate Maelstrom. In order to generate Maelstrom, you need to be in melee combat, and you're just getting kited by a lot of specializations right now, while also not having that super impactful damage. Buff Wind Fury, buff Wind Fury. And also bring back the Wind Fury animation while you're at it. So there you have it, guys. That is my tier list for the non-tank specs. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about Ellie. Oops. And I've been playing a ton of Ellie on both the beta and the pre-patch. Ellie is so fun to me right now. S tier is going to be one of those meta-defining caster specs, in my opinion. The downside and why I'm not putting it in the probable nerf category is Ellie does have to cast a decent amount. Your Lava Burst procs a little bit less, but your Earth Shocks, your Ice Furies, your Elemental Blasts, and even your Lava Burst procs are hitting fairly hard, and you're going to have a variety of comps to play as an Elemental Shaman. And yeah, good time to be a Resto or an Ellie Shaman. All right, so yeah, that's about it for the DPS and healers. So I'll go over, and I'm just going to order this really quick in terms of like what the best tank specs are at the moment. You're going to have Guardian. You're going to have, surprisingly, you're going to have Brewmaster Monks. I think Brewmaster Monks are going to be a super popular spec for Battleground Blitz as soon as they catch on. They're very tanky. They have pretty decent self-sustain, and they have really good off-healing, which is surprising. Excuse me. And then after that, you probably have your Havoc, your Vengeance Demon Hunter, and then your Blood Death Knight. Both these classes have pretty decent self-healing. The reason I'm going to put Vengeance a little bit higher than Blood is that you have better mobility to jump away on flag maps, whereas Blood DKs actually might be a little bit better on maps that are not flag maps, because you can just take a healer and kidnap them and just bring them away from the team fight and annoy them while also being pretty much unkillable. Prot Warrior actually has surprisingly, it has some damage, especially compared to where it was before, and it has some pretty decent self-sustain, but I don't think it has too much over the other more meta tank specs. And then Prot Paladin, sucks, man. Needs some sort of, just remove the mana cost on Word of Glory and let Prot Paladin bubble with the flag, and they could be a viable flag carrier. They really could, but until that happens, Prot Paladin is really not going to see too much PvP in a competitive sense. All right, guys, that is my tier list. I hope you guys enjoyed my rambling. Again, these specs, I could definitely foresee some nerfs, and anything B tier or below, I could see some buffs for, especially these classes in D tier, man. I hope Enhance and I hope Ret catches some buffs, or at least for Ret bug fixes. All right, if you guys enjoyed, leave a thumbs up, subscribe, follow me on Twitch, Twitter, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.